Good evening, everybody, and welcome to An Evening with Luna Press. Tonight, I am celebrating the launch of the Utopia of Us, and I am here with our editor, Teika Marija Smits, and I am here with our very, very talented writers. So without further ado, I am going to let Teika take it away for the evening. And I'm just going to take a little sit back and enjoy the evening.
Hi, everybody, and thank you very much to Francesca for making this whole thing happen, really. If it wasn't for Francesca taking on board this project, kind of taking my crazy idea and running with it, this whole thing wouldn't be here. So I have huge gratitude for Francesca, and she made the publishing journey ever so smooth, and it was a delight to work with her. And I'm very, very proud of this fantastic book, The Utopia of Us, and so many authors, so many wonderful authors within the book. And thank you. It's lovely to see so many authors here who managed to make it tonight to read from their stories and to tell us a bit about their inspiration. So if some of you don't know about The Utopia of Us, it's actually inspired by Yevgeny Zamyatin's We, which is a fantastic book. There's lots of different editions out there, different translations of it. And the striking thing about this book, which inspired was the direct inspiration for George Orwell's 1984, is that 2024 is the centenary of its first publication. But interestingly enough, the publication first happened in the US and in English, which is obviously a bit strange for the fact that he's a Russian writer and writing in Russian. And if you were to read you'll probably understand it is quite a subversive book, and basically the authorities at the time did not like its, let's say, its rebellious content. And so it's actually a very powerful book which has spoken to so many people over the years. And it has influenced many other famous science fiction writers to go on and create their own dystopias. And I really feel it's filtered through into popular culture, so that we see films like the Hunger Games and Divergent, etc. We see these cultures, these governments, these oppressive governments, and how one person can try and escape out of that, maybe change the society. And I find it a very interesting genre to read, and I appreciate the genre greatly. It can be rather depressing, but I also like the moments in We. There are comedic moments in there, and there's real sort of tender moments as well. And the more you read about Yevgeny Zamyatin's life, you come to understand that We far better. And it gives you an extra richness to the work. So I would definitely recommend people reading We, and I really hope that lots more people will be reading it this year. And I hope that people will then obviously come and pick up a copy of The Utopia of Us, featuring 15 authors, and their stories were directly inspired by We. But if you go on and read the anthologies, you'll find that there's huge variety, beautiful variety in the stories. And I think you'll probably get a flavour of that tonight from listening to the readings from the authors. So what we're going to do is we're going to hear from each individual authors. We're actually going to go in the order that they're published, that they appear in the anthology. And so I'm just going to pass over to our very first author, and that is Aliya Whiteley. And I'm going to let Aliya introduce herself and just talk a bit about the inspiration for her story, and just to hear a lovely snippet. So I will let you take it away, Aliya.
Hi. So I write strange short stories and novels about aliens and mushrooms and utopias that might be dystopias or the other way around. And I was really delighted to be asked to be in the anthology. I have a bit of a weird relationship with We, in that I read it going to be a couple of decades ago, and was really bemused by it. I think I was a big fan of 1984, and I I liked the seriousness of that. And there is a comedic element to We that I was really bemused by. And I've thought about it often without really sort of coming to a decision about how I felt about it. So when I was asked to kind of go back and look at it again, I reread it, and this time around the humour of it really leapt out at me, and that's what I enjoyed the most about it. So I tried to capture some element of that in my story. And yes, I also wanted to write about the importance of the rocket ship as a symbol of hope and change, and the possibility of change and the possibility of hope in whatever form that took. I'm really interested in that idea of how we go on from day to day because there's a symbol of hope in front of us. So my story kind of ties in with that, and it's called Intrinsic, Extrinsic, Terrific. So I was just going to read the very first section. I am U914, and I write to those above. The underground system is a marvel of the United States. It takes the numbers wherever they need to go, to work, to live, as tools within our magnificent society. But I wonder how many, riding the transit, sitting in their own thoughts of the day ahead or just past, have spared time to consider the role of the underground worker. Perhaps they have glanced at a driver. Those who lead the way, steer our paths, are often lauded, and rightly so. I only humbly ask that we think of those who maintain those paths, the diggers, the layers of track, and so many jobs beyond that, or rather below that. My job was explained to me as thus. The act of travel has long been observed to encourage a loquacious quality, a dissolution of social barriers in those who undertake even short trips, and this can lead to inappropriate interactions. Those surface numbers who use the underground system can be encouraged to keep their barriers intact. Every transit contains monitoring devices. Conversations that are deemed personal in nature are discouraged. Small discrepancies lead to tiny reprimands. Every seat is fitted with a prickler. Pricklers deliver the lightest of shocks to the back and thighs, but it's usually enough to change the course of a discussion. What was that? Some say. Did you feel that? Or they fall silent, dissecting what they experienced. A tingling through the seat, or coming from their organs, maybe. A medical issue. They think of doctors and inner workings. I watch them try to make sense of it, and by the time they've recovered, the journey is nearing its end. They disembark and return to the surface and think no more of it until next time. Those who are having mutually excitable conversations might require another level of intervention. Their names are passed to the Bureau of Guardians. We, underground team UT32, activate pricklers thousands of times in a single shift. When a shift is done, we do not return to the surface. No stepping out into the sunlight or into the cool breeze of the night. No visiting the places to which the stations lead, the plaza of the Cube or the Botanic Gardens. No, we take the elevators down to our living quarters, divided into dormitories, and we sleep until the next shift begins. We are separate from those who live above in every way. Nothing is contaminated with their habits, their feelings. Sometimes I think, whisper it, that we are a purer form of communal existence that they are not ready to embrace. Having said that, it can get cramped down here. Space is a luxury in the underground life. I have a bed in dormitory U900 to 988, and some of us do snore, which is a bodily affectation one must bear, but it doesn't always lead to a sunny disposition on shift. I have a regular time slot once every 20 shifts in a private cubicle. I have pink tickets, of course, but I find the work tiring and am rarely in the mood for such interactions. I must admit I try to discourage colleagues from asking for that kind of emotional output from me, mainly by making disparaging comments such as, "What a funny old business," and "Honestly, I don't think that's one of my skill sets." It seems to work. That leaves me free to use my cubicle time to sit alone and simply enjoy being singular. Sometimes it feels illicit. I write this down so that you can appreciate that I am fallible too. I am like you, and you are high above, but you are like me. We are linked. We are one. Sitting at my desk, monitoring the numbers gives me purpose. Yes, through the rigorous application of the pricklers, but beyond that, I have a goal to help everyone to accept the connections between us, to realise that conversations in which numbers moan about their singular issues, lifestyles, and differences are unhelpful. Is this pride, to think I might be able to find answers to these problems? I cannot say. All I can tell is that there is a strangeness to our society that excites me, and it lies in the difference between what is inside me, what I feel to be true, and what the world presents to me. Basically speaking, what's this whole being alive business about?
Thank you very much. That was beautifully read. I love the whole idea of your protagonist using his pink ticket time. So for those people who haven't read the book, the pink tickets are used for basically when the people in We want to have sex. I love the way that he's like, what a funny business.
Yeah, that's not for me so much, you know.
Yeah.
It's okay, it's fine.
And just the way he just wants to use it to have a bit of peace and quiet.
Yes, he goes and sits on his own for a moment and has a
I love the idea of just that kind of that introvert in me is like just sitting and being quiet. Yeah, I can relate to that, definitely.
I do think if we were living in a communal system, we'd be like, where's the room for just all the introverts? You know, writers in waiting would be, where's the room where we just sit quietly because I can't cope. So.
Yeah. But they would need we need cubicles as introverts as well, because we can't possibly catch someone's eye, because then we're like, do I have to say something? Do I not? So yeah, I love that whole idea. I mean, you know, the whole story is obviously it's very you, but it's set in the world of We, and that's what I was going to ask you about, because I was very interested by that. By so many of the stories that came to me were either completely not in the world of We, or they were set in the same kind of time. And Sophia's story is actually very much further in the future, which I found fascinating as well. But yours went to the past. What was that about that made you think, I want it to be before the whole rocket starts being worked on? What was it about going backwards that you found kind of interesting? What interested you about that?
It wasn't my starting point at all. I wrote a different story to begin with that was set in a different world that kind of took the ideas I was interested in, and I just felt like I'd failed to capture the thing that I was interested in, and what that was this idea of hope. And I wanted to go back to the beginning of hope, because in the novel we're kind of at the end of the process of the rocket and what that symbolizes and whatever. And within my story, it starts before the rocket's even sort of being built, but the main character doesn't realize that. Really, they think it's an endeavor that's being undergone already. So I was kind of interested in how we go from the beginnings, the kernels of ideas, into something that the ball starts rolling and more people join in and hope builds. So it goes from the moment where an idea of hope is commencing to a much bigger idea that we pick up in the actual novel.
Yeah, no, I love that. I thought it was, very striking and very different. And as I was speaking kind of a bit at Chimera, I was talking about the ordering of the anthology, and how I felt that yours should sit at the front, because it introduces us to the world of We. For somebody who has read it, they would recognise that, and those who haven't read We, they would get a flavour of the world already. So that would like really nicely sort of ease them into the anthology if they're reading it in the right order. Some people don't.
Yeah, that's true.
Fine. But there's a little part of the editor me is like outraged by not reading it in the right order. But the writer in me is like, and the reader is like, just read whatever you want to start with first. But that was the idea, and why I put Artie Ester's piece next was because that focused on a rocket, but in the far, far, far future, which I thought was a really nice juxtaposition with your two stories.
Yeah,
Artie's is a very different world, so they could kind of speak to one another. And like I said, the rocket is a symbol of hope, isn't it? And but equally, you can see it in a dystopian way, in that it could be a symbol of taking, let's say, parts of our world to other people that we shouldn't be bringing to them.
We're conquering as well.
Yes,
so,
exactly. And in Michael's story, we will have later on how the rocket takes on a very different kind of idea as well through art. So the rocket is a really sort of it has very rich symbolism, doesn't it? So
Yeah.
So I thought that was fantastic. So so huge thanks for that, Aliya. So thank you very much for reading, and we'll move on to the next person that we've got here, which is Anne. We've got Anne Charnock. So I will pass over to you, Anne.
Hi, thanks Teika, and thanks Francesca for putting this together. My name's Anne Charnock, and I've written 4 novels, and probably relevant to this evening is that 2 of my novels are dystopias written in the same world. That's A Calculated Life and Bridge 108. And in fact, I'd just finished the first draft of my first novel when I read We, and that's back in 2007. So I did enjoy coming back to reread it again to write my short story for this. And one of the things I picked up on my rereading was that the main characters of We and my first novel are both mathematicians, and in We, the character D503, he actually deplores the irrational natural world of trees and animals and insects. And I decided in writing my short story that I would flip that world. So whereas in We, the one state exists within a glass dome and there's the wild world outside, I decided that I would have pristine ecosystems within the glass domes of my story, and it would be a desertified world on the outside. And I was also interested in the underlying themes of revolution within We, and that comes into the story as it progresses. So if I read just from the beginning of my short story, which is titled The Earth Heals, Silent Days, Vagaries and Savagery. I send my team ahead of me to the monthly gathering, a 40-minute trek through the forest and a half-hour stroll across grasslands, while I don my jacket and turn on the rain. It's a rare, rare moment to have the forest to myself. I peer out, rain pattering on my hood, a riot of hazel, birch and sessile oak. Emerald epiphytes colonize every tree, every boulder and rotting stump. Miniature polypody ferns litter the moss-covered branches and colonize the tiniest nooks wherever rainwater collects. I'm alone, but not alone. A male redstart flits from an oak branch to the undulating, verdant forest floor, gorging on insects living within these swelling, prodigious waves of mosses, liverworts, and lichens. I turn 360 degrees. There is no exposed bark whatsoever, no bare rock, a gorgeous, soaking, burgeoning of life. I take a deep breath, knowing these trees are giving me oxygen, giving me life, and I release my breath, knowing I am in turn bringing life to the trees and all the greenery that befriends them. It all makes sense. Everything makes sense here. We will achieve our goal through our children and grandchildren ever onwards, as we have held true all these years, building on the endeavours of our antecedents. 1,000 acres for 1,000 years. We will preserve our temperate ecosystems for the future, hoping, trusting that our withered world, the outside, will one day be healed. But whenever I look beyond the glass panels of our biospheres, I wonder what exactly would tempt everyone to decamp, to leave our glassy domes, the only home we have known. The redstart reappears, fiery red breast and red tail, black face and black throat, popping out from a tree cavity in one of our oldest oaks. Does he realise he lives within a biosphere, that his freedom is constrained, that he cannot migrate? I clamber through the rainforest and stride out across the grasslands, feeling energized and light. The summer meadows will always have this effect on me. I thank the ancestors who battled through the centuries to keep their precious biomes alive, dealing with one near collapse after another. These summer meadows are surely their sweetest benefaction.
Thank you very much, Anne. That's beautiful. I was going to ask. I mean, I was when I read your piece, I was really fascinated by this idea of. I mean, you write beautifully about nature. I think there's a nature memoir in you, maybe. But I mean, the world is so beautiful and it's so rich and it's thriving. You know, that the plant life and the wildlife are thriving in these biospheres. And yet, what I particularly like is the way you paint the way that the culture or the society is really quite stagnant. They're not moving forward. They're not wanting to explore the outdoors. So was that something is that something that fascinates you, that really intrigues you about where does revolution start? Because I remember that story really leaving me sort of in two minds. It was really thought-provoking. I was thinking, well, we do need progress. We do need to move forward. So we need to have that kind of reactionary or sort of revolutionary aspect. And yet there is always the wanting to be safe, and this, thinking, well, this is safe where we are now. We are in balance now. Are we, by pushing outwards or forwards, is this going to be a bad thing? So was that something that interests you, that you wanted to explore?
Yes, I mean, I was very interested in the whole political aspect of We, because it was written against that background. And at the current time, it just felt very rewarding to write a story where there's stability and everybody's pretty calm and there's no extremity. There was something rather soothing about writing about a world that's conservative with a little c, where any changes are kind of very, very minor. So I set up the world that, yes, everything seems lovely and it's calm, and just start to introduce, as the story progresses, that actually, even though it seems kind of idyllic, that there's a kind of feeling of stasis, that perhaps things aren't moving as well as they should do, that perhaps people should be bolder and embrace risk a little bit more, because they do have to stress their ecosystems in order to make sure that they're working. And my main character feels that the population as a whole ought to be stressing themselves a little bit more, and starts to question the kind of political and governance system that they've set up within the domes. So that was, so I don't want to kind of tell the whole story. But in effect, it is about where discontent can arise, even within a world that seems quite idyllic.
Yeah, no, I just thought it was so thought-provoking, and even in this beautiful world, there was this, like you said, stasis or stagnation, and it was really, really interesting. And like you said about having to stress the environment and the natural world. I mean, I find it hard, even my own garden, which is just just going crazy at the moment. And yet I know that I have to take some bushes out or weeds out or shrubs out so that the other plants can survive. And there's always that sort of, but I kind of feel bad about doing that, and yet you kind of have to if you want everything to have a chance. So so I found that very interesting. So thank you very much, Anne. And it's lovely to hear from you and to hear your reading. So thank you very much for that. Now we'll be moving on to Tim Major. So over to Tim now.
Hello, I'm Tim Major. I'm very grateful to have been involved in this project, the Utopia of Us, which is a fantastic book. I was going to speak a bit about my story and how I came to write it, I suppose. So I came to We reasonably late on. I read it maybe 10 years ago. but I read 1984 when I was, a young teen, or maybe earlier than that, maybe 11 or 12, and I knew Brave New World. But actually, my introduction to sort of city dystopias like this was an encyclopedia of science fiction that I had when I was a kid. And particularly, there was a picture in it of Fritz Lang's Metropolis, just the city, with all of the monorails and the cars travelling through, and it was so beautiful. And the emphasis of the article was about the beauty of the model, I suppose. And then more recently, I saw that a facsimile of the same model in the Cinema Museum in Berlin, and again, it was about the beauty of the mechanism and how it worked. And so I thought, when I came to write a story about city dystopias and about we, I felt really interested in this idea of creating this sort of dystopian city, but as a creator, enjoying the mechanism of it and the kind of predictability of it, which is quite comforting. Because I think that when anyone writes dystopian science fiction or horror, for example, it can still be very comforting to sort of create order. So my story is about a filmmaker who works more or less solo in sort of early cinema in the 1920s, a bit like Georges Méliès in his greenhouse studio, and a bit like a filmmaker called Alice Guy. But yes, she's creating order in a sort of chaotic life. So my story is called Production Pristine White, Pale Green. And it's in the form of a diary, which makes it slightly difficult to do a reading. 1924 production diary, continued from previous journal. 18th of September. The magnificent city, the preparatory work as at times seemed endless. The thick carved spires are crisscrossed by bridges that provide ornamentation and structure. The panes of the ink windows are streaked with paint to appear as rays of light upon glass. The city is beautiful, but it is hardly ready. I have adjusted the position of my camera again and again by minute degrees. I am convinced that there is one position, and one position only, that will display this utopia as it ought to be. Question: how ought it to be, M? Answer: the apotheosis of order, a vision depicting the channeling of productivity into fluid motion, lacking human errors, lacking emphasis on ugly human bodies. I will find the correct position, and I will not begin filming until I'm satisfied. Later. Frequently, H insists on watching me as I work. He gets in the way, leaning on his cane and watching with beady eyes. I have told him that one assistant, B, that is sufficient, and that we require no oversight. I've begged my husband to retreat to the house, to his books and his pipe, as befits his advanced age. But men, and their need to oversee. It is very hot here in my garden studio. Its glass panels ensure adequate light for filming, but sunlight streams in constantly, and there are no shades. The panels are tinged green, a literal greenhouse, which is ideal for light captured on celluloid. When filmed in monochrome, pale green appears more white than white. It is an unreasonably warm September, and the green studio is positively sweltering. I sweat as I work, so I'm in shirt sleeves, like B. He and I are the same age, and sometimes I enjoy the fantasy that we're equal. But B's arms and body are strong, and his mind is at peace and free of clutter. More often I celebrate our differences. We celebrate them together. If only there were no need for H at all. But I must remember that it is my husband H's money that built this studio, and yet it is surely wrong that he is to take sole credit for our production. B and I have determined the ideal angle for the camera, but no celebrations. There is a new problem. When H was absent, napping, we performed a test of the workings of the model city, which is installed at the very centre of the studio in order to capture every available ray of light. B pulled at the hidden threads that control all motion within our city. The box-like vehicles moved, the signage animated, tremendous. But the citizens are another matter. They snag constantly on their prescribed track. The jerky effect is absurd. 19th of September. This morning I wept as I yanked the threads and the figurines only wobbled. Where is the machine-like order I envisaged? So I hope you enjoy that story when you read the anthology, and I hope you enjoy the whole anthology. And thank you so much for letting me be a part of it. And I hope the rest of this launch goes very well. Bye now.
Next, we'll be moving on to Anna Orridge.
Thanks very much, Teika. Hi, I'm Anna Orridge. I am, for most of my time, a climate action advisor for schools. However, I do write in my spare time, mainly as kind of passion, as a source of enjoyment. I write mostly short stories, and those tend to fall into the categories of eco-fiction or horror. So this is a really nice chance to try a different genre, sci-fi, and I really enjoyed it. I like the opportunity, especially to kind of write. I decided to pretty much set my story within the world as Zamyatin depicted it, which feels a bit boring now I've seen the other stories in the anthology, but actually was quite a nice challenge. There's a bit of a kind of nerdy element to my character, so I quite liked trying to kind of get all the details correct. If I haven't got any details correct, please don't tell me, because it will bother me. Anyway, in terms of kind of how it inspired me, I read it about 25 years ago when I was at university, and I did enjoy it, and it did strike me. I think at the time I was struck most by the depiction of sex and romance. Actually, the whole idea of the pink tickets. When I came kind of to it later in life, oddly enough, it was a very minor element of the world building that struck me, and that was the description of food, which actually hasn't gone into in terribly much detail, and possibly that's why it drew me in, because obviously there was a story there to be told. He actually describes all the food as being a kind of petroleum-based mush. I mean, obviously, as modern readers, we know that wouldn't be possible. That's an impossibility. But it's just such an intriguing idea. And I think part of what intrigued me was, as an environmentalist, I'm very aware that unfortunately, because of various environmental problems, and the nutritional value of our food is going down. And also, obviously, there are microplastics. We're inadvertently consuming microplastics. So it was a kind of interesting comparison. But also, I think I was just very... it led me into kind of a train of thought about, well, presumably these people have been used to this food from babyhood. They've never known anything else. So it made me wonder whether it would be possible to have a sense of longing for the full range of tastes, even if you'd never experienced them. And I suppose that's really where this story came from. Incidentally, something I really wanted to share. When I wrote this story, I thought that there were 5 flavours which human beings recognised. But apparently, according to the latest research, we can actually detect 7. And one of them is ammonium, weirdly enough, probably because it helps us detect if food has been spoiled. And the other one is oil, fats and oils. And this is going to be called Oleogustus, which I just think is fantastic because it sounds like the name of a Roman emperor. I just really wanted to share that today. Anyway, I will now get on with my story. Thank you so much. Great. So, yes, this is the protagonist is N34. N34 is an apprentice who is going to specialise in producing sustenance. N34 stared down at his plate, a series of intersecting circles which, in his view, had been less than perfectly executed. He plunged his fork in and realised the texture was wrong too. There were 2 permitted textures for sustenance, a jelly-like consistency, one with a little more resistance and bite, probably rather like the flesh the savages used to feast upon. Then there was the hard one. They were not, under any circumstances, to be deviated from or combined. The apprentice had clearly chosen hard for his plate, but had allowed it to be cured a little too long, and it was actually gritty against the tongue. N34 caught a few other numbers stealing a glance at him. The crunching was loud enough to hear. He swallowed, despite the abrasion, and the discomfort matched what he recognised as his rising irritation. He immediately commenced the steps he'd been taught to calm this anger. First, the source. Most immediate, of course, was the embarrassment caused by the crunching, but that was not all. He was enjoying that sensation. Even now, he could not stop himself, pressing one of the crumbs against the palate of his mouth with his tongue to better extract the umami flavour, one of the 5 permitted. N34 dropped his fork and got up, leaving too fast to observe the reactions of the other apprentices to his abrupt departure from the sustenance hall. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anna. I mean, I love writing about food in stories. It might not be for every reader, but I really like it, and I think it really gives it gives a flavour of the story and the setting and the world. And that's what I really liked about your story. That I think people often, I think, underestimate how important and how lucky we are to have so many different types of foods and textures, because there are people who don't have enough as we do, won't be able to experience all of that. So I do feel we're very lucky to have that, and it adds such pleasure to your day-to-day life. I mean, sometimes people talk about, or in some science fiction, taking pills, or like protein pills, or like, just getting rid of food entirely just so that we have this one thing and it will make our life so efficient. And yet the reality is that eating and sharing meals with people can be highly pleasurable. And I just love the idea that if you took all that out, just really how boring that is. And yet when your protagonist gets that flavour, you kind of think, oh my gosh, this is it. This could be a rebellion right here. So, I mean, what was it about that? Was that sort of just were you were interested in the sort of the petroleum jelly food and what that would do to you? And that was kind of your seed of rebellion. So kind of how did you take that forward? How did you think, oh, well, what's this protagonist going to do? And what would happen to him in the future?
I suppose in the book, the sources of rebellion are really quite, although those which seem to spur for rebellion are the more cerebral things, like poetry, for example. In fact, I think one of the poor characters ends up getting killed, don't they? Because they produce this poem that is focusing on them as opposed on the state. And also we get kind of quite a lot of description of the music, which sounds absolutely dreadful. It's basically just scales, but they think is wonderful. And the geometric art. And that's kind of, it's that, what I suppose a lot of people would think of as a higher level, that would spur people on to kind of come together and try and overthrow the powers that be. But I just like the idea of somebody kind of encountering a sensory experience for the first time, and the idea of that kind of opening up ideas, and kind of a new way of life potentially, and taking your trains of thought down different alleyways. Because I think it really is possible. We've got that thing in the West where we regard it as the lower urges, the lower impulses. But I really don't think so. And as you were saying, I mean, if food is described really well, the intellectual and the sensory kind of come together. Like if you get the best of the food critics and the restaurant critics, they bring those two things together. They bring the sensory pleasure together, but also the pleasure of words. So I think they're probably more closely aligned than we think. And it might possibly depend on your personality as well. I mean, the protagonist in the novel is an engineer, so I suppose, you would think that he would be tempted by something intellectual. But there are other people with different personalities and different aptitudes, and perhaps they'd need something else to kind of spur them on. And maybe food could be it.
Yeah, definitely. And what I was struck by this the other day, actually. I was thinking that Zamyatin would probably particularly appreciate yours, because in his in the biography of Yevgeny Zamyatin, there are little sort of diary entries about his life, and he very often lists and talks about the food that he's having, and he'll say, "Oh, that was dreadful, but this meal was really nice," and he'll list everything really, really pedantically, exactly how much caviar he's having, etc., etc.
Oh wow!
And so it's wonderful to, obviously food was, really meaningful to him. But, if you also think about it, he was working on icebreakers and traveling to and fro in different parts of Russia. And when it's that cold and you have very little to do, he took pleasure from reading his books. Yeah. And what he was going to eat. So I can sort of relate to that. When the weather's bad and you don't have a lot to look forward to, books and food, kind of pretty
comfort, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Absolutely. And of course, another thing about it is that it's which I should have mentioned, is it's a source of identity. So that seems to be in many parts of the world. As I used to teach English as a foreign language, so I became very aware as I was talking to people from different countries exactly how central food was. Often to their pride, to their identity. It was always what they said they most missed. If I ever said, what you've been away from home now for 4 to 6 weeks, 90% of the time it was food. It was some food item. So it just shows that it's a real kind of heart deep thing, isn't it? And I suspect that's why he did mention it, because if you were to be stripped of your identity by the state, yeah, it would make sense that food would be one of the things that would be clamped down on hard.
Yeah, I mean, and all of us, if we were to go into a coffee shop, we'd probably order something quite different. And, there'd be lots of arguments about, how you drink tea, etc., whether you have milk or not, all these things. So, yeah, it is kind of part of a person's identity, isn't it? So thank you so much for that, Anna. That was great, and thank you very much for bearing with me with my pedantic editing, because some people might know that I've actually got a PhD in organic chemistry, so I was being very, very pedantic about any time Anna mentioned something about chemistry or food chemistry. I was like, right, I'm going to double check that. So thank you for bearing with me. So
it was great. I really enjoyed that experience, because I hadn't had an editor really who'd kind of zoomed in on that kind of thing before, so it was very good to go through that process. I think it improved the story, so thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anna. And now we'll be moving over to Liam, who's going to tell us a bit about his story and do a reading.
Hello, my name is Liam Hogan, and I've recently moved, so I'm surrounded by boxes and no broadband. So I won't be joining you on the Zoom. I'm sorry to miss you guys. My story in the Utopia of Us is a peculiar job, the wash, someone waiting for me. And it deals with the feeling of being left behind by technology, the advent of the mobile phone, the speed at which teenagers become experts and leave us all behind. This takes it to an extreme, as an example of society being changed by technology and the impositions that society then has on the populace. I'm going to read from the beginning a short extract. The moment of connection is like opening a door in your brain. A door you didn't know existed. At the flick of a switch, you've gone from a dingy studio apartment with a pull-out sofa bed, staring at the grey walls, to a rambling mansion with extensive gardens, a host of conservatories and terraces, and even entire floors waiting to be explored. Every room is crowded with strangers boisterously welcoming you to the... You yank the skull cap off your newly shaved head and gasp for words. Everyone does. And I smile encouragement and squeeze your arm for reassurance. It's professional rather than genuine, but you don't have time to work that out. Like 95% of inductees, you're already feeling the keen loss, the claustrophobia of being stuffed back into your single occupancy box. All that you've known and grown used to your entire life now dull and cramped. With trembling fingers you snatch for the headset, too eager to do anything right. I help you put it back on, making sure the thread-like wires don't drag as I gather them together. In the moment before your eyes glaze over, you thank me, but that's what I'm here for. There is, according to the latest research, a correlation between those who avoid recreational drugs and those who balk at hive-tech telepathy. They share a particular set of deeply held, usually unvoiced opinions, as well as certain mental qualities of which low-level autism is just one fairly frequent aspect. Asked why they never got round to trying drugs, even as they were being progressively decriminalised, a common answer is one of control, not a desire for it, but a fear of losing it, and yourself at the same time. A fear of quick and sudden addiction, not to the supposedly pleasurable rush of endorphins mimicking chemicals, but to a new and uncertain state of mind. It might mean a less anxious, happier person, but will that person still be the same person? You can predict these refuseniks, these telepathic Luddites, with decent accuracy from a short questionnaire. We allocate twice as long for those sessions. Which, and expressly against my nominal job description as someone whose role it is to help people connect, I rather look forward to. They're eccentrics, outliers who feel safer in their own skulls, happier in their own heads. Which doesn't mean they're happy, far from it, but... you're talking. now with the headset back on and your eyes closed, describing, haltingly, the sensations, the chorus, the symphony of other people's thoughts and feelings. A short-lived phase, this, for most. You do it for my benefit, trying to share, not yet realising there are more than 1 million people that you are already sharing with. And you don't know, can't possibly understand, how hearing even these awkwardly dug out words, these experiences once removed, makes me feel. It is a peculiar job I have been recruited to, though I have my own selfish reasons for accepting it. And I'll leave it there. Now, if you want to read how the rest of the story continues, you're going to have to buy the book. And hope you guys have a great launch party. Goodbye.
And moving on now to Nadya Mercik. Over to you, Nadya.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Teika. So my name is Nadya Mercik. I actually started as a literary translator, and I was translating science fiction and fantasy into Russian. And then I decided, well, why not try something of my own? So I write both fantasy and science fiction, and I think most of all I'm interested in like human relationships, and actually the dystopian genre speaks to me a lot because I think it's like it tests the personality. So that's why it's kind of ideal to write about people's relationships and people, their personalities. So interestingly enough, though, I grew up in Russia. We wasn't included in our like school curriculum, so I read it much later. I think even after I read 1984, but I was like really, really inspired by it. And when I was rereading it for this anthology to write the story, straight away after finishing reading it, I went to listen to it as an audiobook because there are so many details. I was at a loss what to like write about because so many things spoke to me. But in the end, I thought that there is this character 090, and she has quite a disturbing, I'd say, fate in the book, but we don't get any proper resolution. And her personality, her character gave me a lot of food for thought, and it just went into thinking about how in general the idea of a family would work in the world, like similar to Zamyatin's, where, well, you get pink tickets and everything is so regulated. Like, what is there? Like about the family, and especially about mothers and children's relationships, so that bond that exists, what would happen if it weren't there. So that like made me think, and yeah, that's what the story like gave me ideas for the story. That's how the story been born. And I guess I'm gonna read the like first small extract of my story, which is called Boy, Perfect Citizen, Mother. Your country takes care of you. Perpetual happiness of its people is the purpose of the government. Pure minds, perfect citizens, great nation. Borders are a sanitary must. Great Rusovia stands on its own feet, where the second Noah's Ark, the finest in the best new world. Olga stood on the 20-centimeter wide white line that separated the right-hand side current of people from the left-hand side, 1 foot in front of the other, like a gymnast on a balance beam, to avoid being swept away. Several people had already noticed her strange behavior and were obviously wondering why she wasn't on the crossing island, which was only 20 paces away. But she couldn't move. She looked at the processions of people and saw the floors. Somebody a centimeter ahead of his fellow walkers, another out of step with the rhythm of the whole. A set of 2 loud, jarringly noisy heels. The perfect organization of humanity was breaking apart. No, Olga realized, it was she who was broken. The out-of-period bleeding had stopped, but there was still a tugging pain in her abdomen, crawling through her like an eel in the mud. Her hands instinctively went to her tummy, and she felt for any strange hardness, but there was nothing, just the sensation of an empty sack, as though only recently her tummy had been full. Yet, if anything was seriously wrong, surely she'd get a notification on her subdermal. Besides, she'd just been to the sanatorium for her bonus rejuvenation sleep after the rotational family leave. So she had to be well. The pain simply had to be a figment of her imagination. But how come there were all those folds of skin and unevenness under the fabric? And why did her uniform stretch so tightly over her breasts? You were supposed to lose weight in the sanatorium, not gain it. A pedestrian on the right collided with her elbow, ruining her balance. The round buoy of her body was almost untethered and pulled into the current. Olga curled her toes inside her shoes like it could help her have a stronger connection with the white line. But it wouldn't last forever. She had to decide where to go. Yet neither home, nor work, not even the small cafe with the view on the Fontanka River, where she liked to read a book, were her places anymore. The whole city felt alien, exuding animosity, hostile. The subdermal heated and displayed a message. In a quarter of an hour her shift began. If she didn't hurry up, she'd be late. The school logo disappeared, substituted by the rolling menu. Borscht, mashed potatoes and cutlets, and for the afternoon tea, cottage cheese bake and compote drink. Her assistant Mila must already be there, pulling out the pots and pans, setting the programs in the cooker and ovens. Olga suddenly longed to file a migraine which her subdermal wouldn't be able to recognize, and to dive into the wrong current, then another wrong one, until she ended up somewhere on the outskirts of the city, maybe even further away. But she couldn't. Not because the subdermal would trace her location, but because of this feeling of a super thin, almost ethereal fiber running from the top of her head, down her spine, into her belly, and then outwards. An artery pulsing with blood, a power cord, a cable that was transmitting into the void. Olga felt dizzy and nauseous. Her head hurt, as if a giant child was shaking it like a rattle, knocking something inside her brain unconscious. She felt a warm wetness gathering between her legs and looked down to see that the fabric of her trousers had gone dark. She should get into one of the currents. If she just stood on this line, she might bleed to death. She took a step, toppled into a mass of people, a once comforting and structuring mass. She yearned for the connection, and yet the contact, when it came, felt hard and jostling, even when a man caught her gently, signaling the need for medical assistance. Even when they enveloped her in a tight ring, murmuring compassion. She was trying to ask them for fresh air and space, so that the signal her detached cable was sending could go through. Her subdermal singed with basic medication, yet the world was slipping away still. The only tangible thing was the incorporeal cord with no attachment.
Thank you so much, Nadya. That was fantastic. Such a beautiful story, but also really quite a chilling story. And I think those are the two things that really attracted me to your story. I mean, I found it very moving. I was really hoping that somebody would write a story about motherhood in the kind of we dystopian society. I mean, it's a theme that I keep coming back to in my own writing, the mother-child bond and the strength between the mother-child bond and what can happen to disrupt that and the implications of all of that. So I was just so happy when I saw your story and just the way that this protagonist that we might not kind of think of as a particularly strong or physically strong person, the way that she was so strong within herself and that she had this determination to keep going even though these mysterious things were happening to her body. And I love the way you talk about how when she's when she's on her rotational family, all these strange things are happening and she just doesn't quite understand it, but it must all be a figment of her imagination. And it's you think about really how chilling that is, the kind of the gaslighting of what's happening to this woman's body. So, I mean, when you were writing it, did you also have anything like Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale in your head? Were you kind of thinking, this has some parallels here, or did you kind of mainly focus on we and kind of your kind of new world that you'd created? Or,
I mean, I don't think I thought like directly of The Handmaid's Tale or something like that. It's just, the whole idea, because there is so much that comes into pregnancy, and it's not only the mother-child relationship, it's the whole process. It's how, like, what happens to your body, and like even with the events that have been happening in the States not that long ago with abortion and everything, all those things probably, like maybe on some subconscious level they were speaking to me, just feeding a bit more into the story, like what happened, because it's something a woman wants or might not want, like to have a baby, but it still leaves an imprint, and it leaves an imprint on the child as well. So there was so much that I wanted to like talk about. So I hope those small bits speak to the reader.
Yeah, I think they really will do. And I just, like I said, I just love her strength, but also just how chilling a world it is when you actually think about that. And yet there's kind of real moments of beauty. Like I love the way you describe, St. Petersburg, really, isn't it? So yeah. It's just so beautiful, and the white nights, and you just kind of feel as though you could be there, and you want it's really immersive, I felt. So did you enjoy writing those parts as well?
Well, it was a treat for me as well, because I was thinking like where to set it, because obviously when you write a dystopia, often you don't refer to a particular place geographically. If you even like hint at a country, for example, you don't go like geographically deeply into some place. And for me it was a treat, because with everything that's been happening, I haven't been to my home for quite some time back in Russia, so it was really nice to wander and remember, and probably help this get like the white idea of the white night, and those circadian rhythms, which are also sort of regulated in this story. It just worked really well together. So because St. Petersburg is that kind of city, I think, that exudes strength. It's much more European than other Russian cities. It's much more elegant, but at the same time, with the city being built on the marshes and everything, it requires some certain strength. So it's everywhere, I guess, in the story, in the elements of the story that were chosen in the end.
Yeah, no, I found it really beautiful. I really appreciated, I appreciated so much of it, but I really liked being immersed in that work, in that place. I really got a keen sense of place. And what I found was striking, again, from the biography, Zamyatin's biography, is how him and his wife experienced childlessness. So apparently that comes across in some of the short stories that he wrote. So this was clearly on his mind as well. So again, I think this was an aspect that you picked up on, that the strength of the mother-child bond and that yearning for a child was something that I think Zamyatin had direct experience of, and really was very important to him, and was on his mind a lot in his own writing. So I think that's just so lovely that it's in the anthology, and I hope that readers pick up on that. So yeah, thank you very much, and again, thank you very much for dealing with all my very pedantic edits, because I'm a former breastfeeding counsellor, so I was picking up on those things, wasn't I? I was like, right, let's talk about the umbilical cord, let's talk about the breasts, and you were like, oh, okay. So I was like really imagining, well, what would her tummy be like and everything, and just imagining these folds, and she's put on weight and everything. And yeah, you bore with me very well. So thank you very much for that.
You.
Okay, so we're now going to move over to Fiona Mossman. So Take it away, Fiona.
Hi, yes. So I'm Fiona and I write speculative short stories mostly. I also happen to work in a library, which will become relevant. And I had two ways into we. One was that I studied Zamyatin's we in university. And the other is that I'm a huge Ursula K fan, and my favourite book of hers is The Dispossessed, although it's hard to choose a favourite, to be honest, but I think that one is my favourite, which is subtitled An Ambiguous Utopia. And that's very much, she was very inspired by Zamyatin and we in particular. She considered it a perfect sort of science fiction novel, and she was responding to it a little bit in The Dispossessed. And she's always exploring ideas about duality and what can be beyond that. So I think one of the things she says is that there's always a seed of utopia in dystopia, and the other way around as well. So that's always been very inspiring to me. And when I was thinking about what to write for this call, like Nadya, I had a lot of strands that were calling to me, a lot of things that I was interested in. There's so much in it that we can pick from, which is demonstrated by the breadth in this anthology. And the way that I found to bring a story out was to kind of keep a bit of the plot and keep a bit of the character, but if I change the setting, I found my way in. So mine is set in an endless library where we are all librarians who must shelve books eternally. So that's the way that I found to bring some of these ideas into a setting that no resemblance to any library that I have actually worked in, purely coincidental, but that was something that I could use as inspiration. So I'll give a little reading now from my story, which is called The Library's Perfect, an Era Underwater. The trolley is still mostly full of books, but I do not rush. A librarian's work is all about precision, after all. That is how we contribute to the great library, and there is always shelving to be done. As I push my trolley up the ramp, I exchange greetings with other librarians, each of us moving at calm, contented paces, applying the correct amount of force to send our trolleys upwards at a steady speed, or to prevent them from skiting downwards too fast. How many books have you shelved since I saw you last? One asked me with her usual quirked eyebrow and sardonic smile. I grew up with this librarian before we were librarians, and we received our stack of books on the same day. 2, I announce, halting my trolley as she did the same. And you? 3, the other librarian says. I was lucky. 2 are migrating birds, only 1 floor apart. I smile, gracious. Last time we'd met, I'd shelved fully 4 more than she had. It was simply a matter of distance. Until next time. I nodded to her, and we each continued, one upwards and the other downwards with our precious piles of books. I do enjoy my little rituals with her. We've carried on like that for as long as I can remember. The library is perfect. I have travelled many, many leagues in the library, and I have never found an end to it. Its regularity is exemplary. Its knowledge is the sum of everything that can ever be known. Every book has its place, as ordained by the great, beneficent librarian, and each location in the glorious classification scheme has the precise book for each shelf written in numbers that translate to one of the shelves in one of the rooms of the library that is the world. In this scheme, the book is directly equal to the shelf, which is directly equal to the subject in all its specificity, set within its divinely correct location in the whole constellation of knowledge. This is the first principle. Everything has its place. To find your own place and to stay there, precise and unchanging, is to be perfectly happy, perfectly contained. This is what the library teaches us. I reach the floor where the numbers emblazoned across the doorway are a match for the first part of my next book's shelf mark. I enter the doorway and check the shelf mark again, deciphering. I let the numbers lead me through the twists and turns of room after room. I remember when I first started, this was the most difficult part, knowing the layout of the rooms and the pathways by which the shelf marks dictated your steps. Left, right, straight across, left. I used to be so nervous that I would make a mistake. Now my steps are confident and my route is unerring, and through each room the signs comfort me. Room 5736, flowers that grow in acidic soil. Room 5737, flowers that grow in alkaline soil. Room 5738, flowers that grow in mixed soil. I keep going, through book-lined room after book-lined room. Well, we do not read the books, of course. I like to say goodbye to each book as I leave it where it belongs. The books that I have come to this room to shelve is green-backed and handsome, and I flick through its pages, enjoying the illustrations, catching glimpses of its text. I'm admiring a full-colour plate of dainty purple and orange petals when I hear a fellow librarian in the corridor, and I start guiltily, but they do not look in. Putting the book back down, I begin to count, book by book, shelf by shelf. I am getting closer to the number that represents the final location of the book, and the fizz of excitement begins inside me. This is my favourite moment, the moment I locate the correct place. My fingers skim the spines, my lips forming the numbers, each one closer than the next, until I reach the place, but there is something wrong. There is already a book there. My book, a book on the medicinal properties of pansies, would fit perfectly between the book on the origins of Viola whitlockyiana and a slim volume that seems to be a disquisition on the velvety texture of a pansy petal. But instead, there is an interloper, snug and smug and completely wrong. The shelf mark on the spine doesn't fit the sequence at all. My eyes skip from the code for the shelf to the room code to the floor code, back through the whole shelf mark in disbelief. The book is not simply a little out of place, its whole floor's wrong. How could this be?
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Fiona. Yes, an endless library. There's a part of me that's like, oh, that's just wonderful. That's just like utopia. And yet, as we were talking about in Chimera, there's something very chilling about it because no one ever goes beyond the library. What and why? What are these books? There's books about pansies, and yet has anyone ever seen a pansy? So, it's, we were talking about earlier we were talking about how rockets can be symbols of something that's quite hopeful, but obviously symbols of destruction. And yet we kind of tend to think of as libraries as safe, lovely places that can, we can be educated there, we can learn so much there. And yet a library in which everything is about classification and these books never get read, and we don't know what's beyond the library, turns it into a prison, it turns it into a dystopia. So is that something that you clearly are interested in and you wanted to explore for this?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yes, I love libraries. They are wonderful places. Yes, but it's the ethics and of sort of knowledge production and knowledge keeping, gatekeeping, that sort of thing, that I focused on as my sort of dystopian element. And then, yes, also bringing in things like, of course, we're not meant to read the books. That's not the point. Because, yes, in a similar way to a lot of the other sort of dystopias that we find in this book and in We and in other books, it's that sort of control element that's we're in the library, we have a task. The task, it doesn't matter whether the task is meaningful or not, the task is needing done. So we've all got to shelve our books, and then sort of drawing that out to the extremes as well, so that it takes you a lifetime to empty your trolley of books, and the library is so huge. Those are all the elements of just making it an even bigger, more extreme version of a dystopian library. And it's the classification scheme that's the bit that really does tap into stuff in the real world. I would say is that when we're creating knowledge, there's often a process of comparison. What's like one thing, what's not like another thing? Where are we going to put it in our scheme? And that happens in every walk of life, but it just happens to be very visual in a library because it's laid out on the shelves for everyone to see. And we have classification schemes that help librarians, decide where the books need to go. And a book can't technically be in few places at once, but often we want them to be. So that's the kind of choice about what's where it goes, and also what's left out as well. That's also what's important, what's not part of the scheme, what gets emphasized, what gets put first. Those are all methods by which power is exerted. So it was good to investigate that in a what is often a utopian setting.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because like you said, that sort of classification is, you find that in all sorts of industry, in all walks of life, don't you? I just think about the publishing industry, how, if you are trying to sell a book, you have to almost in one line pitch it as this and that, and tell us the exact genre, the form, and which readers would like this. Well, maybe everyone. It's so hard to classify your book. Well, it's sci-fi, but it's also this, or it's historical fiction, but it's also that, and that's really sort of gives people a headache, doesn't it? And some people want that. They want to be told what kind of book a book is. And some people kind of fight against that and go, I just want to enjoy it. I don't care what genre it is, if it's kind of
absolutely. Yeah, we kind of need classifications to understand things, but also, there definitely comes a point where they restrict more than they help. And we can sort of fight back or see what's beyond them. I mean, my other example is like a supermarket aisle. And if you've got the Asian section, it's one sort of small aisle that's very set apart from everything else, then that's telling you something about where you are and what the dynamics are.
Yeah, and one thing I was going to ask, because this is another book that I greatly enjoyed, was Susanna Clarke's Piranesi. I mean, when you were creating your story, did you have that a little bit kind of, did at any moment you go, oh, that sort of, or was that just, that was just independent of that, or?
I think I have read Piranesi and I love it. But it wasn't consciously on my mind when I was creating this. But definitely once I'd finished it and I shared it with somebody in my writers group and she was like, oh yeah, this is very Piranesi. I was like, oh yeah, that's very correct. Yes. Including the fact that the protagonist has set themselves the endless task of cataloguing all the statues. So I think that's quite a fun echo between the two of them as well. Yeah,
no, that's fantastic. And like I said, and in Piranesi, again, it feels like it's a kind of beautiful otherworldly world, and yet it is dangerous as well. So it rather like your library. So, but I hope, I think you said last time we spoke about this at Chimera, it's a standalone story. But if you've got more stories, if you want to enlarge the world, I'm there to read it, because I would like to know what happens if you ever do write any more of it. So yes,
thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Fiona. And now we're going to be moving on to Michael Teasdale. So over to you, Michael.
Hello, I'm Michael. I'm a writer of mostly science fiction short stories. My relationship with this book sort of began in the early days of Amazon, where we were kind of hoping there would be this quirky little online bookstore that didn't become a huge monster, but it was a way to get books then that maybe we couldn't find, or to get recommendations on other things. And I think it was the year 2000 that I first read it. I'm from Newcastle upon Tyne, and I was living in Newcastle upon Tyne at the time. I was going through a period of reading various dystopias and picked this one up. And I was interested to discover actually that Zamyatin also spent some time living in Newcastle. So, because I believe he worked in the Swan Hunter shipyards in Wallsend. This is where he got the idea for the integral, the icebreakers that he was constructing there. So there was a kind of weird, sort of eerie parallel as I was reading it, discovering that this author had lived in the same place as I lived, even though we imagine him as living in Russia or being far away. And outside of writing, I've also been working in education, and this has, I would say that the story that I've written here is influenced by some of the more depressing aspects that I've seen sort of creeping into education when it comes to creativity in the last few years, with the rise of AI and the way that it's being kind of unanimously pushed on anything, to the extent that depressingly some primary schools are now removing art from the curriculum, which is just astonishing to me that could be a thing. But the fact that we would grow up without helping artists to discover themselves. So the story that I wrote is kind of linking to those fears. It's not set in the world of we, but it's imagining a planet that has perhaps been visited by the rocket, and a similar situation has arisen to the point that art itself has long ago been viewed as almost a criminal activity, or an activity that only insane people are involved with. And their art has become regulated to the fact that there are only certain mass-produced images that are being distributed around society here. So the character in my story is a government official who's working in this environment, but there is a underground sort of quiet revolution happening. There's graffiti appearing on buildings. There's things being left behind to try to help get a message out that maybe art is not dead. So I will read a bit from the middle of the part. The banned artifacts were easy to miss, laid out for more curious citizens to find in the nearby gutter, or hidden among cracks in the wall, presumably even left behind for the ministry's own new recruits to stumble upon as they entered or exited the building. At first we thought they were primeval weapons of a kind, tiny sharpened sticks that might make for neat assassination tools by the primitives we were at war with. I held one in my hand as I supervised the latest cleaning, a cylinder with a sharp pointed end. Foolishly, as if my own brain had been corrupted by what I'd seen, I found myself unable to resist pressing it against the end of my finger, and was horrified to see it leave behind a mark. Concerned that this may be some type of trace poison, I returned in haste to the medical unit of the department, where the nurse was able to assure me that it was nothing more than the leftover residue from the mineral graphite. Bagging the item for evidence, I took it for analysis to the Department of Historical Artifacts, where its true nature was ultimately revealed to me. It was what, in pre-Enlightenment times, people called a pencil, a crude tool used to scratch out words on paper. Of course, words were not the vandal's intention here. Oh no. The pencil was also once a popular tool in the hands of the mentally insane, the citizens who called themselves artists, and who would commit their madness to paper with the intention of causing confusion, puzzlement, and in extreme cases, philosophical doubt in the minds of citizens whose grasp on order and structure were already tenuous in the days before the Great Awakening. Put simply, had these tools fallen into the hands of ordinary citizens, then all manner of unlicensed imagery might have sprung forth as a result. The disruption would be intolerable. Imagine it, our perfect, orderly society once more consumed by anxiety, uncertainty, and chaos. It is the dream of our enemies in the second states. They hate us for our stability and will do anything to sabotage it. We must not allow them to succeed. When I returned to the complex, I could still sense the strange mark on my finger, even though I had scrubbed it away entirely. It reconfirmed to me just how dangerous even the smallest exposure to an unlicensed image can be. I spent some time in my office that evening, staring at the purity of image 234, letting the comforting regularity of its rectangular body wash over me, gazing with solemn understanding at the sharp rising point of the triangle at its tip. It was, as ever, the perfect, tranquil image of a rocket. By the time I was finished with my meditation, I could barely recall what the pencil even looked like.
Thank you very much, Michael. I remember when I read your story, I just kind of I love stories to do with art. It's again something that I write about myself. It's very close to my heart, and I was just so pleased that this your story had come in, and I could tell it was going to be about art, and it's going to be very subversive. And I just remember reading it, and I was just transfixed. I'm just so in your world, and I was almost like my breath was kind of like, is it gonna? Yes. I thought it was just so wonderful. I just kind of felt just really with the protagonist. I wanted them to succeed in their goal, to rebel. So I don't think that's giving too much away for people, but it's just this wonderful idea of how art even though you might not have it in your everyday life, once you start noticing it, and once you start picking up a pencil or something, then it can transform your life and it can make you think in other ways. Like you said, it's kind of sad about some schools taking art off the curriculum. So was that something that you wanted to obviously address, and the way that art is so powerful and we must have it in our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a cult-like attitude that's kind of swept in with AI in the last few years, that it can just come in and do everything for us, which is great. There are things that we could benefit from having done for us, but I feel like we've got it back to front. We're using it to, what we should be using it to is the grunt work, to take away the boring menial work that we could speed up to allow us creative pursuits, to allow us to be able to do the things that we love. And instead, it seems to be the reverse, that we've become transfixed with the idea that we can enter a prompt and create something that is viewed by, I mean, I've seen this in discussions by many people using the term "I created it" or "I made it." It's like, yeah, but you didn't really, and it all comes from plagiarism anyway. So it's all being scraped from other people's work. So it's a dangerous time, I think, because we're not really having a discussion about it. But it's an important time, especially in the field of education, that we don't push this message to children that this is something there's no point investing energy in anymore. Or don't become a writer, don't become an artist. There's no future in it, because as is explored in this story, what you end up with then is just a stagnant pool of the same art again and again and again. I do see some elements of hope. I see some people the conversation is changing. I heard somewhere that, I think I read somewhere on Twitter, that teenagers are now referring to AI art as boomer art, which is reassuring that they're starting to reject it and categorize it as what old people are liking. But it still worries me that this kind of thing is happening. Yeah. So I really wanted to explore that. I think the last 3 stories I've written have explored similar themes, because it's a strange and precarious time that we're living in now.
Yeah, and I think, like I said, clearly, I think it's on a lot of writers and artists' minds. And I mean, I have a friend who's a comic book artist, and so a writer and an illustrator, and he pointed out how the AI art often has this kind of it's very samey. It kind of has the same look about it. Almost gives it this unreal sheen that you can tell that it's kind of been made by the same thing, like a sort of just like this mixture of kind of a big
the 6 fingers is a giveaway usually.
yeah stuff like that. So it is, it is a bit sort of, it's very disconcerting.
But even when it comes to writing, it's being pushed now as a way to improve your writing, to get, like, do your writing but then give it to AI to improve it. But what are the future authors and writers of the world learning here about what's appropriate if this is the message they're getting, that it doesn't really matter how good their work is because AI can improve it. So it's a scary thing.
It is, yeah. And I mean, I was also going to ask about your story. I mean, like you said, some of the posters that you have, all these sort of allowed.
I realised it got very dark here in Romania. So.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for joining us all the way over from Romania. So you're a few hours ahead of us, aren't you? So you're probably getting a bit tired. So I was going to ask you about like some of the allowed art in your world. I mean, did you sort of that kind of, to me, had the flavour of sort of Soviet Union art, sort of quite blocky and like kind of basic. Was that in some way, was that an inspiration or at all? Or?
Yeah, I think I was imagining it as kind of propaganda style images. So the key thing that I thought about was the rocket itself, that they are kind of worshipping the rocket, having visited their world and brought this message to them, and a similar sort of society has arisen. But then I started thinking about the fact that the rocket and a pencil are basically the same shape. So this character starts going through a kind of existential crisis. He's always seen this image of the rocket as kind of the perfect, pure image, but then he starts wondering what happens if I color the tip of the rocket in and turning it into an image of a pencil instead. So I wanted to kind of, because it's a dystopian society, but it's a hopeful kind of message that hopefully even in the worst situations when these things occur, there's always an underground. And I have seen that as well in education. There are still kids who are pushing back against this. They are still kind of fighting and rejecting what's being pushed down onto them. So I do believe that like art will prevail ultimately, but we are in a fight.
Yeah. Yeah, no, well, that's great. Thank you so much, Michael. It's been lovely talking to you, and thank you very much again for coming all the way from Romania to join us for tonight. Thank you. So we will now go on to Anna.
Thank you, Teika. My name is Anna Soon. I write science fiction and fantasy, mostly short fiction. And most of my stories are typically solar punk or eco fictions, and they often take an adaptation lens on how we might deal with climate emergency. So I think perhaps I mostly write through utopia rather than either dystopia or utopias. And because of that, I think my relationship with we is a little bit more complicated now than maybe like a decade or two ago. I still greatly admire it as a work of literature, but it took me a while to get to it. I read like 1984 at least a couple of times, Brave New World a couple of times at least, and The Dispossessed multiple times before I got to reading Wee. So yeah, my story is the anatomy of emotion, the carving of chance, and Seize the Moon. I often think about how grief shapes us as individuals. And the less empowered you are in society, the kind of more grief you carry around. And the more grief we carry around, the more it holds us back. So my story in Utopia of Us looks at how, even in kind of a supportive and caring environment, a character could still be trapped by their own grief and expression of that. And therefore, it can be difficult to make change. I just thought it was kind of, for me, relevant to the current times, if you like. So I'm going to start reading from the middle. I propped myself up on my elbows, feeling the slope of the hill under my calves. I'd have to go down soon to help Oma Olga with the harvest spirit, as I'd done every year since I'd learned that I had the gift of craft, but no one would miss me for a little while yet. Towards the horizon, the jagged edges of the ancient city sparkled, its glassy ruins almost glowing in the dimming gold of the sun, as if someone had smashed the top of an egg and left behind the shell. Most of it had been overrun by vines, brush, and wildflowers. Our chronicles recounted how it had been built over a river, so when the city fell several hundred years ago, the forest around it reclaimed the remnants with speed, trapping relics under leaf, root, and tendril. Em used to joke that we could make a home there, on the inside. Think of it, see? So much ancient glass we could repurpose, she'd say. A coil of honey brown hair at the base of her neck, her smile the pink fragrance of geranium, like every time she daydreamed. Tools I'd fashioned for her from the remains of an ancient flying machine jangled on the belt around her waist. Imagine how many photobioreactors we could build. We could make winter so much more comfortable for all of us. For some reason, she'd only bring this up whenever we were alone. I let a moment of silence pass. Recent winters had seemed harsher, but I just couldn't see how our whole community would change our seasonal habits, traditions we had kept year after year. We scavenged within the old city limits for materials now and again, but our tales told of something bad that happened there a long time ago. Changing minds would be no small feat. You honestly really think everyone would move? Oh, see, Em had sighed, impatience creeping into her tone. Once they realized it'd be consistently warmer, that we could cultivate a regular source of winter food, of course they would move. We'd have to transform the place, make it livable, start small, show others how it could be done until enough of us decide to work together. Not impossible, but every time I tried to imagine Em's vision of the future, my throat tightened. What if she overestimated my abilities? How rapidly would she tire of me? insecurity, the soft earth at the edge of a precipice. It had been late spring then. I remembered because the poppies had just begun bursting out their vermilion petals, tiny red silk skirts fluttering in the breeze that still carried a chill. Em had stretched out beside me on this hill after breakfast, under this very elm tree. The remnants of the glass city caught the light differently in the mornings, a little less sparkle, a bit more haze. We'd sat here, stealing sips from a bottle of last winter's mead that we'd smuggled from Zed's father's reserves. My mind swept blank from the sheer bliss of being next to her, bare feet touching, legs lazily entwined, the meadow green against our skin, hers porcelain pale, mine tree bark dark. Desire, a turbulent propellant, not unlike the rocket fuel the ancients employed to such devastation. You could build what we need. I could adapt our algae culture, or perhaps we could use some enzyme to the same effect. I couldn't tell if Em was simply thinking aloud, but her eyes had taken on the faraway days. It'd only take us a season or two to get it working. You'll see. Em, the ever-optimist, the forever dreamer. Me? I just wasn't so good at change. Uncertainty, a heavy fog at dawn's edge, the kind thick enough to blind you. I wish I had known what I wanted the way Em always seemed to. My fingers had twitched at that moment, aching to roll a 20-sided die inside my pocket, but I'd known by then that Em didn't approve of my habit, so I fought against myself, battled against a cloud of guilt. At some point, Em had shrugged, given in. Anyway, seems you prefer to stick to the way things are. That stung a little, a puncture wound from a thorn under a rose. Then I tried to sound clever, forward-thinking. But what if we fail? We could also succeed, Em promptly said. You're always so either-or, see? We have the skills. Won't you even want to try? Em had a gift with the abstract, with things we couldn't see with our eyes. She'd engineered the solar-powered lights for our settlement, built community ovens that required no fire to cook. Glass? I could work glass. I could work nearly every material I put my hands to. Stone, clay, wood, metal, fibers from any plant. The glass could be restructured to become a vessel for the algae, but also insulation for us. We could grow some food through the cold season, yes. We could have made it work, had we chosen to. Had she chosen me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. That's beautifully read. And I really like the way that you write about emotions. That was one of the things that drew me to your story. It's just so distinctive, and the way you just exactly describe what that emotion is. That was I felt that very powerful. So I really enjoyed that. And I really enjoyed the solar punk aspect. I think we were talking about this and how it's really quite hopeful, isn't it? The way that you have this ancient city, and yet they kind of have they're more in tune with the natural world, your characters, and yet they have this, they use solar power and they have quite a bit of technology. So again, that was something that you clearly write about. So do you think this is the way forward, that we need to again refine that balance and yet take things such as solar technology and use those for the future?
It's actually cheaper now to power with solar than with coal, but because of, it's really difficult not to get political on this point, I'm sorry. Actually, renewable energies are becoming cheaper, but we don't have the political will to do it. So absolutely. But I think what is also interesting to me is many of my stories, I want to say quite a number of them, examine this kind of notion between technology and lore, science and lore, because lore is just ancient or old science that a lot of things we haven't actually constructed experiments to prove yet. And so in this story in particular, I actually took inspiration from some really ancient European traditions, which I know actually still happens in some countries today. The notion of farming and the notion of how you would have a symbolic harvest, symbolic celebration at the end, using the remainder of the harvest. And I was asking you about this because I actually don't know the science about it. I would love someone to tell me whether it's something around like keeping the microbes for year after year in order to have a good harvest. There must be a reason why we do this. but we don't know why. And a lot of these now, because of the kind of industrial, size of farming that we have lost some of these traditions and our understanding of how cycles of the earth work. That was a bit of a rant. Apologies.
Well, that's very interesting. I don't think I have the answers for you, but yes, I mean, industrial scale farming definitely, disrupts, biomes and microbiomes, etc. But obviously, industrial farming does give us a huge amount of cheap food as well. So again, I'm always one of those people who's never going to go like that's evil, that's evil. I'm just always going to be in the middle and go, oh, that's interesting. Let's think about both sides. So I'm always very contrarian. I'm always just going to be, saying the opposite. But yeah, I mean, I really like the way that you had this, that they were more in tune with the natural world, and yet they had these, they had the solar technology, and yet you had that call back to we with the ancient city. Was that something right from the start you very deliberately wanted with your story, that you were going to incorporate it in that way?
Sort of, yes. And to your point, I think what I was trying to also address is that you could be in tune with nature, but is it also going to sustain the way we want to live? And that was the question I sort of, very gently posed, in that, do we move or not into a safer space where we know we could reuse, rebuild the world around us, shape it around us a little bit more. When I reread We for this anthology call, I actually did this very systematic thing of marking the places that called out to me, and one of them was the record 27, where they mentioned the people on the other side of the green wall, and that was it. And there was not very much about that, so I was like, well, I like to explore that, and that was how. Yeah, I guess considering that the themes I like writing in and that I feel at home in, it was not difficult for me to choose the outside world and say, hey, what if?
Yeah, and I really like the glimpse of the sort of the ruined city as well. That was really beautiful to me, the way that, you sort of a little sort of just a snippet of giving us this imagery of plants and wildlife reclaiming the city, and how they could go in there and, and possibly rebuild in a very small kind of but meaningful way. So I really like that imagery as well. And I mean, like Fiona's, I mean, do you think that there is a bigger story to come out of all this? Because, it'd be really interesting to read it. Or is it staying as a short story then? Or
I haven't thought about it, but I quite like the world, so you never know. Never say no.
Yeah. That's wonderful. I just want everyone to write more, basically. Just read more. That's great, Anna. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. So we're going to move over to our final contributor, and it's over to Rayn now.
Thanks, Teika. I'm Rayn Epremian. I write sci-fi and fantasy as fiction, poetry, and screenplays. And I only found We about 2 years ago. I was reading a bunch of Ursula Le Guin's book reviews and came across the one for We. Typical of Le Guin, to change my life with a few choice words. So obviously I immediately went to Project Gutenberg and read the novel, and I was just amazed that I had never heard of this book, despite having read everything by Vonnegut and Atwood and Huxley, and was particularly incredulous about how similar 1984 was to this book, with pretty much the same plot, and in particular the idea of this man being literally seduced into revolutionary thinking by a woman. So it was just about a year later that I saw the Luna Press anthology call, and so it was all very fresh in my head, and I wanted to interrogate this idea of sexuality and revolutionary thinking from an asexual perspective. Because we were talking about the pink tickets earlier, and that's a way of obviously controlling and limiting sexual encounters in We, but also it's a form of compulsory sexuality. So I decided to tell my story from an ace character's POV, and I also decided to write from the perspective of the spy character, who is a big part of the architecture also of both We and 1984. So I'm also going to read from the middle of my story. I think it's sort of the hinge of the story, and also begins to explain what the title is all about, which is Swimming Hunger, a Rusted Drum, a Ruinous Discovery. 6th report, 10 days before launch. Today, they, E48 and C21, went together to the Museum of Earth, where the archaic practices of pre-corporatization are kept for educational purposes. With clear knowledge of the undeveloped past, we can arm ourselves against similar follies in the future. This was the first time I have observed the two of them together outside of the engineer's apartment, or their brief interactions in the facility. I have not intervened and shall continue to await further instruction. Today, something odd happened. Where usually, during their illicit meetings, they engage in sexual activity, today they did not. At first, I thought perhaps their attraction had run its course, and we were now in the clear, as surely they would then stop seeing each other and the engineer would be safe from temptation. But in fact, something stranger and more concerning may be taking place. Their physical habit has given way to something else. Today, they simply walked together through the various exhibits, at times speaking of nothing of import, as far as I could tell, unless they have designed a strange and elaborate code. No discernible ideas or plans. Simply small talk. Yet it did not seem small. It is difficult to explain on the page. I have tried transcribing the conversation, but it looks like nothing when written down. It was not the words themselves that seemed noteworthy, but their behavior, or perhaps the very act of their speaking. Even their not speaking, perhaps more so. Apologies. I am not being clear. It is difficult. I am not at all sure what it is I am trying to describe. They smiled and once or twice touched hands. Watching them, a strange feeling came over me, a sort of shyness, as though I should not have been watching. I have never experienced this in the past, even during their sexual congresses. Another feeling, stranger still, then grew within me. A sort of opening or emptiness, like the hunger one feels after a long and healthful swim in the recreation center. But there is no cafeteria at hand to quench this hunger with a protein ration. I don't know what it is. It is as though there is more space inside me than I knew. I suddenly found myself hollow, like the steel oil drums in the campus storage center. Alarmed, I stopped at the physio on the way home. The doctors say all is well. Of course, I could not speak to them of the day's events without sharing classified information about my assignment, so I gave no details. I can only assume this is part of some tactic to throw my focus off the scent of C21's perfidy. I still have no reason to believe she or the engineer suspects me of being the one on their trail. But surely she is attempting to gather him to some nefarious purpose. I shall catch them in the act soon enough.
Thank you very much, Rayn. Now, we talked about this in Chimera, didn't we, about swimming hunger? I hope you don't mind me asking you again. I just love that idea. And again, your story was just so full. It's such a bittersweet, so just so moving, but kind of bittersweet. But I love this idea of the swimming hunger as a loneliness, just so poetic. And we actually had some people come up, didn't we? And sort of say, so can you just say something about this idea of swimming hunger and how?
For sure. Yeah, it was such a relief that people at Chimera seemed to relate to that, because it's an idea that's been in my head for so long. And then as I was speaking about it at the event, I was like, oh, wait, what if no one else really knows what I'm talking about? But yeah, I think it's a feeling I kind of remember from being a child. And like when you've spent all day in the pool and you get out and you're just like really hungry and whatever you eat next is amazing. But I just feel like the hunger after swimming is a really different physical feeling to me than any other kind. It's not the same as like after a long run. It really feels this sort of hollowness. And it's not necessarily even like unpleasant, but like you're just hungry. And the only other time I feel like there's a similar feeling is maybe after like a good long cry that you really needed, where you just kind of feel like maybe it's dehydration. I don't know. But that's kind of the feeling I was thinking about. And for this character who is living in a world where they don't have any kind of vocabulary to talk about emotions, I thought that this character would experience a new emotion first as physical symptoms. And I was thinking about what those might be. And that idea of swimming hunger just felt like the perfect analogy, like you said, for loneliness and this idea of emptiness. So it was time to get that one out.
Yeah, no, and that was fantastic. I just love that. And I mean, obviously, I also love we have some graffiti in your story as well, don't we? So I really like the way that sort of related to Michael's story as, again, graffiti as subversive, but this was again against the corporation. So again, that obviously showed us some of your thoughts about neoliberalism and things like that. So did you just, I really like the way that you dropped that in a really kind of subtle way. So was that something you were aiming to do, because you didn't really want it, you wanted to focus more on the protagonist, the spy, rather than kind of make it too big a story, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think that I wanted to kind of hint at these other forms of resistance that might be happening in that world, but are sort of in the background to our character, who's pretty much zeroed in on their assignment. And so, yeah, the graffiti, I think also I named my it's a corporation state instead of a nation state in my story, and it's called One Corp. And I was like, I can't not use One Corpse as a pun. So that became the graffiti that was popping up all over the campus. And there's also the artist character who is a reference to the one in We, who's creating like very geometric art and kind of alludes to the way that art is being constricted in this society as well. So I think I had some things on my mind very similar to Michael's writing as well, that I wanted to kind of pepper in there, but kind of keep in the background and sort of show that there are many people that might be trying to resist this at the same time, but our protagonist is quite thoroughly brainwashed at the start. They're a very good employee, so they don't really maybe take this in the way that we do as the reader.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you had, I like that. I really love that conversation, like you said, between the the engineer and the artist, and how he thought he was using really old-fashioned terms. And I think you had Lizzie as a B, is that right? I think you had.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking that kind of that actually made me think of Anne's story, and about the beautiful nature, and how things like bees. I love bees. They just weren't in that world anymore, and it's just, again, that sadness of it's just beautiful. The way that you're referring to things that had been lost, that just weren't there anymore. Bees and the idea of art and literature and poetry, and it was just, it's so sad, bittersweet, and yet there is some hope in there, and I do hope that people enjoy the anthology and not find it too depressing, because I think everyone's story has that little bit of hope in there, and I think we get that from yours as well. So yeah, I mean,
so. Yeah. I mean, you were saying earlier about the beautiful diversity of types of like ways that we've all been inspired by We, and the different types of dystopias that we have in the anthology. And I think that I hope people also see that as like the many different ways that resistance can happen, and that any kind of place that's being targeted and controlled is probably a place where that can and maybe should be happening. And for me, that's kind of where the hope lies in all of these stories.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, and thank you very much. And that actually will lead me on to sort of a larger discussion, because we've heard from everybody now, and it's been wonderful listening to you read and talk about your stories. I mean, I know that we could go on for a fair long while. I know I could talk about how I ordered the anthology, and I just see so much in your stories, and the way that all the threads and the themes run through it. But obviously we've got to start wrapping things up. But again, so I just hope that our readers and listeners will find the book over at Luna Press Publishing. And I did want to point out that obviously with with Yevgeny Zamyatin being a Russian author, I did want to point out that with the current situation with Russia and Ukraine, that the royalties will be going to the Ukraine humanitarian appeal. So that was always very important to us. So I hope, that this launch has given people a flavour, and that they know that that the royalties will be going to a good cause as well. So I just think that leads us on to sort of to this question about hope, and if anyone wants to comment on the anthology, because obviously people do sometimes think of dystopia fiction as rather depressing, but if people have read the other stories, if they've read the whole anthology, how would you urge people to readers to pick up a copy of the book? Is it completely depressing? Have I found some stories of hope? Is there some humour in there as well? I'm going to pass it over to you fine folk.
Yeah, I would say that, echoing Rayn, that there's so many different stories in here, and they're all picking up on a lot of different things. But I mentioned that I was taking some inspiration from like the plot and the character, and I think there's a general movement in each of these short stories. Obviously, it's quite condensed because they are all a lot shorter than the novel length We. But there is basically, it goes from being in a state of acceptance and not questioning things, and I would say this happens in, I think, pretty much every story. Going from that state, being brainwashed, perhaps at the extreme, and to starting to question things and to starting to see other ways of being in the world. And that's basically what all of these stories are doing, and what's happening in a lot of dystopian novels as well. So I would say that's definitely a hopeful movement and a hopeful sort of change.
I think for me, part of the hope that comes from the book is the fact that when you read a lot of dystopias in a novel length, and you get this vision, like with We, there's a strong sense of being trapped within the world and the insularity of it, and you can't escape from that individual kind of brain that you're within the story and the way that they see the world. And so to have this anthology where you're seeing a whole spectrum of people talking about the way that We affects them is hopeful in itself. It really moved me to read everybody's stories and to see what they'd taken away that was different, and how that individuality reflects across the whole world.
Yes, I'd agree there with Aliya. It's as a contributor, it's fascinating to see the range of approaches, and to read a story and think, oh, why didn't I think of that? It's really fascinating. And I like how humour you can't keep humour out of it in a way. And one of the short stories by Douglas Thompson was interesting in that it's only as you're reading it, and he refers to two states instead of one state, and as you're reading it, you suddenly realize, oh yeah, he's describing today, which is a kind of utopia for some and dystopia for others, like two people stood on the same railway platform. One's living in utopia, one's living in dystopia because of their disparate means, a way of showing haves and have-nots, shoulder to shoulder. So it just gave a really interesting take, not just on imagined futures, but also on the present day as well.
Yeah, I remember at the Chimera Festival, Douglas talking about his story, and I like the way he was, because in his story there is an election that's about to happen, and I like the way he said that he was so, it was just pure luck that happened, but maybe he didn't know that I had a hand in that. I was going to make a joke about it and go, no, it's all arranged, of course, Douglas, because I want this anthology to do so well. But he took a very different approach, as we spoke about at Chimera, where he decided that what Orwell and Zamyatin were doing, and other people like Le Guin were looking at the world as they saw it in that moment, and directly drawing inspiration from that. So, it being satirical and passing comment on the world that they lived in right there and then. And so that's why he wanted to do that with his short story, to really talk about the world as that we're living in today. So I thought that's very interesting. And again, it's all sort of helps to form, again, it's that diversity within the anthology, and it gives it that wonderful range. And equally with Ian Waits' story, he really wanted to address the difference between rural life and city life, and the way there is this difference where people in the city really don't want to care about how maybe their food is generated, about crops and agriculture, and the people who are actually doing that work maybe don't get on with the city folk who they all think are elites. So I love the way that story plays with that, in a sort of, and again with, you have to read the story, but it's read it right until the end and you go, oh, okay, that's very powerful. So that was another story that I thought chimed with some of the other stories, like Anne's, again, talking about agriculture, and Anna's talking about, about food. And the other Anna talking about how again our connection to the natural planet and farming and agriculture is so yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, those themes are there, but I think we had a bit of a query over whether people should read Zamyatin's We first, or they should read the anthology first. So so feel free to jump in if you've got any thoughts on that.
I would say read Zamyatin first. I think you'd derive more pleasure from the short stories. Or maybe just read a chapter of Zamyatin and then read the short stories. I'm not sure, really.
I don't think it'd be possible to read just one chapter of Zamyatin. Because you just keep going. It sort of rips you in and you're stuck there until the end of the book. So I would say, I would agree, and to read the book first. I think the layers of meaning in the anthology would just take on a different color if you do. Personally, I loved how many different ways we can subvert authority in this anthology. I think that's what really, what really excited me to the end.
This actually chimes in quite well with what other people are saying. I noticed Ursula K. Guin came up quite a lot. Which is great, and she's one of the authors who very much moves me and has influenced me. And actually, I did find the anthology generally hopeful, not because the stories were all kind of sweetness and light, because obviously they're not. We've all been influenced by dystopia. There was a lot of bleakness there, a lot of a sense of isolation and being absorbed by a greater whole. But actually, I think the whole collection reminded me of an Le Guin quote, which I think probably a lot of people here know. I'll read it out though for the sake of thing. So I've brought it up. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, and very often in our art, the art of words. So I think that was probably the quotation that most kind of resonated with me after I'd finished, because even despite all the challenges and kind of all the horror, the idea of kind of a woman who's forced into motherhood and doesn't even remember her child, the idea of kind of agriculture is just this soulless field of crops that are failing because there's no kind of spirit there, and all the traditions have died. Despite all of those kind of scenes, I think there still was that sense that resistance is always possible, even kind of in the worst and the most oppressive of circumstances. And all the stories, even the darkest, had at least a kind of glimmer of that, I think, a hint of it.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why I was very keen to end the anthology on Sofia Samatar's story. Sadly, she couldn't be here tonight, but I wanted, because again, that's far into the future, and she's looking at, in essence, looking at Zamyatin's life and talking about how even a small life, somebody living a life who, he did suffer from various illnesses, and it was a small life, and yet, 100 years later, we're talking about his book. We are all influenced about his book. And I just love the way that Sofia's story just captured the fact that even though we might from our day-to-day life think, I'm not being out there protesting, or I'm not an activist, but this is what I can do. I can write a story, I can create some art, I can share my feelings and share my thoughts and share my hopes for the future by doing what I know best, which is writing a story and putting it out there in this small life, and just doing what we can in our own way and what we're skilled to do is really quite inspiring. And in many ways, that's what Zamyatin did. So I felt it was really important and powerful to end it on that kind of hopeful note. And I think Sofia's story just beautifully encapsulated that. I just finished reading her story and I was like, yeah, that's going at the end and we are done then. So that was like a real neat bow at the end of the anthology. So thank you very much for coming. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you just for giving us your time and your beautiful stories. And I hope lots of people will pick up the anthology from Luna Press Publishing, and share it with friends. And obviously read Yevgeny Zamyatin's We. So we'll wrap things up now, and I'll pass things over to the boss, which is Francesca, the publisher, the wonderful publisher who made sure that it all happened so beautifully. It is. People don't often mention the publishers, do they? But it is so beautifully produced, beautifully typeset, and so thank you very much for that, Francesca.
Thank you very much, Teika, and thank you so much to all of you for being with us tonight, and of course to our authors who were perhaps at Camera but cannot be with us this evening. The book is available in paperback and in ebook, and you will find it not just through the Luna Press website, but of course through all online and store that you normally shop in. We are going to celebrate together at Glasgow WorldCon. So if you happen to be there, do come and see us where you see the launch of Luna Press scheduled on the program. Come and find us and have a drink with us while, we celebrate. And I really, really enjoyed seeing how everybody took part of We and made it their own. And remember, it is really for a good cause as well. So it's an anthology that is supporting a lot of things, not just creativity, but also a humanitarian cause. So thank you for all of you watching us tonight and whenever else you're going to be watching this video. Thank you for being with us and for following us. Thank you all for joining us for an evening with Luna Press. And thank you all our authors for being with us tonight and our viewers. Thank you. Good night. Goodbye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Utopia of Us. And, okay, sorry. The dog. So sorry. So sorry, Luna. Just stay there, please. So sorry. Assaulted by a beagle. Amore, stay there. Just wait. So sorry. Very good.
Thank you. Sorry, Francesca. I'm just going to have to sort out this line now.